So one thing that I found in Western media coverage and a lot of the responses to this is that when you mention the role of NATO or the EU, you get pushback from people saying that Ukraine has agency, that it's a sovereign country that can align with whatever blocks it chooses to, and that this is something that the citizens want. So, like in this Sarah Jones New York Magazine piece, which is titled "Russia's Invasion of Ukraine Tests the American Left," she interviews a representative from Lausanne, which is this collective of Hong Kong diaspora. And this person says, the commonality we share with Ukrainians is having our lives, struggles, and political agency diminished by U.S. leftists who prioritize struggle against the U.S. state above all else. And then later in the article, she interviews Karolina, a Polish activist, who similarly says, basically, when I hear about NATO expansion to the east, I'm like, okay, you know nothing about Eastern Europe. Because this narrative strips Eastern Europe of any sort of agency or political power or its own aspirations. It ignores the fact that many countries of the region see NATO and participation in NATO as protection against Russian imperialism. So this sort of framing, of course, assumes people and states exist in a vacuum and act independently of external factors like global capital. So could you discuss some of the conditions and actors that maybe pushed Ukraine toward the NATO and EU blocs, and maybe to zoom out the role of global capital in destabilizing nations, like in general?
Right. And one of the key things that we have to understand when we talk about, agency is, like you said, that agency exists within certain parameters. And when the most powerful country in the world is setting those parameters, then it's critical for us to look at that country. It's critical for us to understand what those parameters are, how they formed, and how it's shaped. And one of the ways that the United States is sort of undermining Ukrainian agency, or at least weaponizing it, is by spending millions and millions and millions of dollars. I think the figure was $5 billion, quote unquote, promoting democracy in Ukraine through, organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, what that means is that the United States is funneling money into civil society organizations in Ukraine, funding media organizations. In fact, I'm sure many of your listeners have seen the Kiev Independent as a major news source. Well, that was actually funded. The only reason that exists is because of a democracy grant from Brussels. And so there's a way to sort of weaponize the agency of a country to change the political landscape, to change the debate, to shift the body politic of a country in ways that the citizens of that country might not even be wary of. And the reason that they did this was in part to generate consent for NATO policies, but also to expand the reach of global capital. Part of the backdrop to the 2014 overthrow was a deal that was being offered from the EU and IMF to the then President Viktor Yanukovych. President Yanukovych chose instead to go with a Russian integration package that didn't have as many of the strings attached as these IMF-EU deals. The IMF deal, it would have required them to, cut back on their education sector, their healthcare sector, cut heating subsidies for the people and get rid of wage controls, things like that. Things that are familiar to anyone who studied neoliberalism and studied like these sort of global development loans. But Yanukovych chose the Russian package, which had far fewer strings attached. And so that's when these protests started. And these protests were funded in part by the National Endowment for Democracy, things like that. And they were supported by U.S. officials, and they were had a major hand in pushing for this. But then after the government was overthrown, instantly, within weeks, the new government that was, the U.S. helped select, the new government adopted a $28 billion IMF loan and then enacted all these changes to their policies. And the main goal of these policies is to make these countries more friendly to Western investors. And I think that's at the root of so many of these global conflicts. So many of the interactions between the US and the rest of the world are based on making the world safe for investors. They are a key driver in foreign policy, but US media doesn't really talk about that. They talk about things in terms of, democracy versus autocracy. And like I said earlier, that's a cartoon view. The real power in this world lies with large economic centers. And those economic centers have major incentives to seek out other countries to, enrich themselves in.